Grab your favorite cup, sit back, and relax. Welcome to Coffee and Audiobook. Have you ever walked away from a conversation with a strange feeling in your stomach? Everything seemed fine. The words were right. The smile was there. But something didn't add up, and you couldn't explain why. So you spent hours, maybe days, replaying it, analyzing the tone, questioning your own instincts, wondering if you were the problem. You weren't. You were reading the wrong signal. We grow up believing that understanding people is simply a matter of listening carefully and giving them the benefit of the doubt. So, for years, you do exactly that. You listen with patience. You trust what people tell you. You believe the best. And still, you get blindsided. The friend who disappears the moment you actually need them. The coworker who supports you in the meeting and undermines you the second you leave the room. The person who swears they care, while every action tells a completely different story. You were not wrong to trust. You were reading people with the wrong tool. Words. Here is the idea that will change how you see every single person around you. Words are a performance. Behavior is a confession. That is the center of everything you are about to learn, and once it settles into you, it does not just make you smarter about people, it makes you calmer because you stop being ambushed by them. Over the course of this audiobook, you will learn why emotional reactions reveal more than hours of explanation, why silence often says more than speech, why pressure exposes character faster than comfort ever could, and why the calm observer, the person who does not react, but who notices everything, is almost always the one who holds the real power in the room. You do not need to become suspicious of everyone. You do not need to armor yourself against the world. You simply need to learn how to see clearly. Think of every confusing person you have ever known, the friend whose warmth came and went without warning, the partner whose words never quite matched their actions, the coworker who was kind in public and cold in private. None of them were unreadable. They were simply unread because no one had ever handed you the instrument to read them with. This audiobook is that instrument, and it begins now. Introduction. The skill nobody ever taught you. You have probably noticed something unsettling as you have moved through life. People are not confusing. People are inconsistent. Someone says they care, and then quietly drifts away. Someone promises loyalty and disappears the moment it becomes inconvenient. Someone smiles, agrees, reassures you, and then acts as if none of it ever happened. The most painful part is never the inconsistency itself. It is the moment you realize you did not see it coming. Most people spend their entire lives believing they understand others. They listen to the words, trust the explanations, assume good intentions, and are repeatedly caught off guard. Not because they are naive, not because they are weak, but because nobody ever taught them how human behavior actually works. This audiobook exists to fix exactly that. Human beings rarely reveal who they are directly. They reveal themselves indirectly through patterns, reactions, silences, the timing of their choices, and how they behave under pressure. Here is the truth, and it is a little uncomfortable. Words are frequently a performance. Behavior is rarely an accident. People say what sounds good. They say what protects their image. They say what keeps their options open. But behavior leaks the truth. You can hear sincerity in a tone of voice, but you see it in consistency. You can believe an explanation, but you trust a pattern that repeats. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said, "Character is fate, not luck, not circumstance, character." 2,000 years later, that idea still holds. The people who repeatedly hurt you were not victims of bad timing. Their character produced the pattern, and the pattern was always the honest forecast, long before the outcome arrived. Once you understand this, something shifts inside you. You stop replaying conversations at 2 in the morning, trying to figure out what you missed. You stop blaming yourself for not being intuitive enough, because intuition is not magic. It is trained observation. This is not a book about manipulation. It is not about control. It is about clarity. It is about learning to observe without projecting, to listen without absorbing, to see people as they actually are instead of how you hope they will be. Most misunderstandings are not born from malice. They are born from assumption. You assume others think the way you think, that their values mirror yours, that honesty is universal. But human behavior does not operate on assumption. It operates on incentive, emotion, fear, and unconscious habit. The sooner you see this, the safer and calmer you become. There is a quiet power in understanding people. When you can read behavior, you stop needing constant reassurance. When you recognize emotional patterns, you stop chasing clarity from people who were never going to give it to you. When you notice reactions instead of words, confusion dissolves. You stop asking, "Why did they do that?" and start thinking, "Of course they did." Not with bitterness, but with awareness. As you listen, let the patterns settle. Let the examples connect to moments you have already lived through. This is not information meant to impress you. It is understanding meant to protect you. By the end of this audiobook, you will not see people as good or bad. You will see them as predictable. And once behavior becomes predictable, emotional chaos loses its grip. Think about how differently a single sentence lands depending on who is watching for the pattern underneath it and who is only listening to the words on top of it. The version who only hears the words spends years confused, hurt, and blindsided by people who, in hindsight, were never actually hiding very much at all. The version who learns to notice the pattern underneath stops being surprised by the same behavior twice, not because people become easier, but because the observer becomes clearer. That is the entire shift this audiobook is offering, not power over anyone else, simply the end of being caught off guard by what, underneath the surface, was quietly visible the entire time. None of this requires a background in psychology, a special gift for intuition, or years of formal study. It requires attention, redirected slightly away from what people announce about themselves and toward what they consistently do. That redirection alone, practiced patiently over time, produces the sharpest, most reliable form of understanding people will ever encounter, far more reliable than any single conversation, any single explanation, or any single promise ever could be on its own. Chapter 1. Words are a performance. Behavior is a confession. Most people believe they are being themselves in every interaction. They believe their personality is authentic, their opinions are original, and their behavior reflects who they truly are. But if you slow down and observe carefully without judgment, you start to notice something uncomfortable. People are not simply being. They are performing. From childhood, human beings learn a quiet lesson that shapes nearly every interaction they will ever have. Acceptance is conditional. Approval has to be earned. Belonging requires adjustment. So people adapt. They watch reactions, test behaviors, learn what gets rewarded and what gets rejected. Over time, those adjustments stop feeling temporary. They harden into habits, and eventually the habit becomes identity. What you often encounter is not the person as they are, but the role they believe they need to play. The social mask that almost everyone wears. every environment rewards something different. At work, confidence is praised even when it is shallow. In relationships, agreement is valued even when it is dishonest. In social circles, humor, dominance, or charm become currency. So, people put on masks. This is not necessarily dishonesty in the criminal sense. It is survival wearing a friendly face. But it means you cannot take a first impression, or even a 10th impression, as the full truth. You are often watching a costume, not a person. Here is the first practical shift you need to make. Stop asking what someone is saying and start asking what someone is protecting. Every performance exists to protect something: an image, a fear, a need for approval, a desire to avoid conflict. The overly confident coworker who never admits a mistake is often protecting a deep fear of being seen as incompetent. The friend who agrees with everything you say is often protecting the relationship more than expressing an honest opinion. The person who jokes about everything, even painful things, is often protecting themselves from being taken seriously enough to be hurt. There is a specific moment where masks slip, and if you know how to watch for it, you gain an enormous advantage. Masks slip under 3 conditions: exhaustion, unexpected questions, and low stakes, moments when someone believes no one important is watching. How a person treats a waiter, a stranger on the phone, or someone who can do nothing for them is often closer to the truth than how they treat you when they want something from you. How a person answers a question they did not prepare for tells you more than a rehearsed answer ever could, because the rehearsed mask cracks slightly and something more automatic shows through. This chapter is not asking you to become paranoid. It is an invitation to become patient. Give people time before you fully trust the mask, not because everyone is hiding something sinister, but because most people are still hiding something human: insecurity, fear, old wounds, quiet exhaustion. Once almost everyone is understood to be performing to some degree, inconsistency stops feeling like betrayal and starts feeling like information. Picture 2 coworkers in the same office. One speaks confidently in every meeting, never hesitates, never admits doubt, and always seems to have the answer ready before the question is finished. The other speaks less often, asks more questions than they answer, and occasionally says, "I am not sure. Let me look into that." Most people instinctively trust the first coworker more because certainty reads as competence. But certainty is a performance choice, not a measure of accuracy. The quieter coworker, willing to admit the limits of their knowledge, is very often the one whose information holds up months later, while the confident performance simply moved on to the next room before anyone checked. Confidence and competence are not the same signal, no matter how often they get mistaken for one another. This is the deeper reason the mask matters so much. It is not that people are lying about who they are. It is that the mask gets rewarded so consistently in workplaces, in families, in first dates, that many people eventually forget there was ever a difference between the mask and the face underneath it. Learning to notice the mask is not about distrust. It is about patience, giving a real person time to show up underneath the performance everyone has been trained to give. There is also a difference worth noting between a mask worn out of fear and a mask worn out of genuine care that simply happens to look polished. A person who compliments others constantly might be performing to be liked, or might simply have been raised in a household where kindness was modeled openly and became second nature. The way to tell the difference is not the compliment itself. It is whether the warmth continues when nothing is being asked in return, and whether it holds steady even when the other person has nothing left to offer back. Warmth that survives an empty exchange is rarely a mask. Warmth that only appears around requests almost always is. It also helps to remember that wearing a mask is not a moral failing in itself. Nearly everyone does it, including the person doing the observing. The goal of this chapter was never to catch people in the act of performing. It was to stop mistaking the performance for the entire truth, so that patience, rather than disappointment, becomes the natural response whenever a mask eventually slips and something more human shows up underneath it. Chapter 2. The 5 Silent Mistakes That Are Blinding You Right Now. Before anyone can be read clearly, the mistakes standing in the way of that clarity need to be removed first. Most people misread others not because they lack intelligence, but because they are making the same predictable errors over and over without ever noticing. The first mistake is listening only to words. Words are cheap. They cost nothing to produce and everything to verify. When someone promises they will change, that they care, that things will be different, the mind wants to believe it immediately because believing is easier than waiting for proof. Words describe intentions. Behavior reveals commitment. The second mistake is projection. Assuming other people think the way you think, want what you want, and would react the way you would react. When someone behaves differently, the instinct is to judge them as wrong, or to invent an explanation that fits your own logic instead of theirs. This is one of the most common reasons people misjudge each other, not malice, but mismatched internal maps. The third mistake is emotional reasoning, believing that because something feels true, it must be true. Charm gets mistaken for trustworthiness. Calm gets mistaken for honesty. Intensity gets mistaken for danger. But charm can hide manipulation. Calm can hide indifference, and intensity can simply mean passion. Feelings are data, not verdicts. They should raise questions, not settle them. The fourth mistake is ignoring context. The same behavior means different things in different situations. Silence in a negotiation might mean strategy. Silence in a friendship might mean hurt. Silence on a first date might mean shyness. The only way to tell the difference is by watching the surrounding pattern instead of judging a single moment in isolation. The fifth mistake is confusing a moment for a pattern. One bad day does not define character, and one good day does not either. What matters is what a person does repeatedly, especially under normal low-pressure conditions. A single kind gesture from someone who is usually dismissive is not evidence of change. It is often evidence of a temporary mood or a calculated exception designed to keep hope alive. Remove these 5 mistakes, and perception sharpens almost immediately. Charisma stops working as a disguise. Assumption stops standing in for evidence. Feeling stops passing as proof. Context returns to the picture, and a single moment stops being mistaken for the whole story. This is where real observation begins, not with more information about other people, but with fewer errors inside one's own thinking. Think of someone who apologized once, sincerely, after months of the same recurring argument, and how easy it becomes to treat that single apology as proof the pattern is finally over. That hope is completely understandable, and it is also, statistically, almost always wrong. A pattern repeated for months is not undone by a single afternoon of remorse. It is undone by a new pattern, repeated across a new stretch of months, under the exact same ordinary conditions that produced the original problem in the first place. Watching for the new pattern, rather than believing the single moment, is the discipline that protects against being hurt by the same behavior over and over while calling it a fresh start each time. These 5 mistakes rarely appear in isolation. They tend to travel together. Projection feeding emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning excusing a lack of context. A lack of context making a single moment feel like the whole story. Untangling them does not require perfect vigilance in every conversation. It requires a habit of asking one honest question. Whenever a strong conclusion about someone starts forming quickly, what is the actual evidence for this? Separate from how it feels. Separate from what would be convenient to believe. Separate from the single moment currently being judged in isolation. That one question, asked consistently, quietly, closes most of the gaps these 5 mistakes usually slip through. Before we move into the next chapter, if this way of seeing people is already starting to feel useful to you, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because every audiobook in this series builds on this same quiet skill, understanding people and eventually understanding yourself a little more clearly than before. Now, let's keep going, because what comes next changes how you experience the first 60 seconds of meeting anyone at all. Chapter 3. The 60-second read. There is a specific window, roughly the first 60 seconds of an interaction, where a person's guard is at its lowest and their instinctive behavior is at its highest. Before the social mask fully engages, before the rehearsed responses activate, there is a small, honest preview of who is actually there. Most people miss it because they are focused on what to say next instead of what is happening in front of them. Posture speaks before a single word is exchanged. Open, relaxed posture usually signals comfort or confidence. Tight, closed-off posture, arms crossed, shoulders raised, usually signals defensiveness or discomfort, and it does not always mean dislike of you specifically. Sometimes it means the person is uncomfortable in their own life right now, and you happen to be standing in front of them. The eyes matter in those first few seconds. Natural eye contact that meets yours and holds usually signals ease. Excessive avoidance can signal anxiety, discomfort, or sometimes deception, though nervousness alone can mimic this, so it is a clue, not a verdict. The very first sentence someone offers, unprompted, often reveals their current priority. Someone who opens with a complaint is often carrying frustration they have not processed yet. Someone who opens with a joke is often testing whether it is safe to be light around you. Someone who opens with a compliment is often seeking approval or trying to lower your guard. The first silence in a conversation is revealing too. Most people are uncomfortable with a pause, and how someone handles that discomfort tells you something real. Rushing to fill it with more words reveals anxiety around approval. Sitting calmly in it reveals self-assurance. Using it to observe instead is often a sign of a naturally strategic mind. The 60-second read is not about snap judgment. It is about collecting an early baseline so that later, when behavior shifts, the shift is noticed instead of missed entirely. It is impossible to know if someone is acting strange without first knowing what normal looks like for them. And the first 60 seconds is where that baseline begins to form. Consider a first meeting with a new client, someone walking in already tense from traffic or a difficult morning. In the very first 60 seconds, their shoulders are high, their handshake is quick, their opening sentence is clipped. A careless observer might read this as coldness toward the meeting itself and spend the whole conversation trying to win over someone who was never actually cold to begin with, only rattled by something that had nothing to do with the room they just walked into. A patient observer waits. They let the first few minutes of small talk do their quiet work, watching whether the shoulders drop, whether the sentences lengthen, whether the eyes soften once the traffic and the morning are finally behind them. The 60-second read is not a final verdict. It is the opening frame of a picture that keeps developing for as long as the conversation continues. There is one more detail worth noticing in this opening window: the space between what someone says and what they physically do right after saying it. Someone who says, "Take your time," while immediately checking the clock is offering two contradictory signals at once, and the physical action, not the polite sentence, is almost always the more reliable one. This is not about catching people being rude. Most of the time, the words are sincere in intention, and the body is simply reacting to a real pressure the person has not consciously named yet: a deadline, a worry, a second commitment waiting right after this one. Noticing the gap without judgment simply gives a more complete picture of what someone is actually carrying into the room with them. It also helps to remember that the 60-second read works both directions. While someone else's opening moments are being noticed, they are almost certainly noticing the same window in return. Walking into any interaction with an awareness of one's own posture, pace, and opening sentence is not about performing a false version of confidence. It is simply about making sure the very first honest impression given actually matches the intention behind it, rather than being accidentally undercut by nerves, distraction, or a rushed entrance nobody meant to project in the first place. Chapter 4. What the voice confesses when the mouth stays silent. The voice is one of the most honest instruments a person owns, and almost nobody trains themselves to listen to it properly. The habit is to focus on content, on what is being said, when the real information often hides in how it is being said. Pace is the first signal. Speeding up unexpectedly, especially around a specific topic, often signals nervousness or a desire to move past something quickly before it gets examined too closely. Slowing down deliberately, choosing words with unusual care, can signal either deep thought or careful self-editing, consciously managing what gets revealed. Pitch is the second signal. A voice rising higher than its normal range often reveals stress, excitement, or anxiety, even when the words themselves sound calm. A voice dropping lower and flattening can signal withdrawal, sadness, or an attempt to seem unaffected when the person actually is affected. Filler words are the third signal. An increase in words like just, actually, or honestly often appears exactly when someone feels the need to add credibility to a statement that has not fully convinced even them. Nobody says honestly before something that requires no convincing. Volume shifts are the fourth signal. A sudden drop around a specific subject often marks discomfort or vulnerability. A sudden rise can signal defensiveness, an unconscious attempt to make a shaky point sound more solid through sheer force. The most valuable skill here is not memorizing these signals individually. It is learning to notice change from someone's normal pattern. If a person naturally speaks quickly, a fast pace tells you nothing. But if that same person suddenly slows down and starts choosing words carefully, that shift is meaningful precisely because it breaks their own baseline. Reading voices is not about catching people in a lie. It is about noticing where comfort ends and effort begins, because effort in speech almost always marks the exact spot where something real is being managed. Think about a phone call where someone says everything is fine in a voice that has gone slightly flat and slightly fast at the same time. The words carry no complaint at all. The delivery carries a version of the truth the words were never given permission to say. Most people, trained only to listen for content, would hang up reassured. A person trained to listen for delivery would gently ask one more question, not to interrogate, simply to make space for the flatness in that voice to become something spoken out loud, if the other person is ready to say it. The voice rarely lies as convincingly as the sentence it is carrying. Laughter deserves its own attention here because it is one of the most commonly misread vocal signals of all. Genuine laughter tends to arrive slightly irregular, a little unpredictable in its rhythm, often catching the person themselves a bit off guard. Performed laughter tends to arrive on a more even, almost metronomic beat, timed a fraction too precisely to whatever just happened. This does not mean performed laughter is dishonest in a harmful way. Very often, it is simple social lubrication, a way of keeping a conversation warm and comfortable. But mistaking performed laughter for a genuine reaction can lead to badly misjudging how a joke, an idea, or even a difficult piece of news actually landed with someone. None of these vocal cues work well as single data points, and that is worth repeating here directly. A shaky voice on one occasion might simply mean someone is tired, cold, or fighting a sore throat that has nothing to do with the conversation at all. The real value of listening to the voice appears only over repeated exposure, learning what steady and unsteady actually sound like for one particular person, so that a deviation from their own normal, not from some universal standard, becomes the signal worth paying attention to. Chapter 5. Pressure is a truth serum. Comfort reveals very little about a person because almost anyone can behave well when nothing is at stake. Pressure is different. It strips away rehearsal. It removes the luxury of a perfectly planned response and forces something closer to instinct to the surface. This is why the fastest way to understand someone's true character is to watch how they behave when something inconvenient, frustrating, or threatening happens to them. How someone treats people who have less power than them, a waiter, an assistant, a stranger providing a service, often tells you more about someone's real character than hours of pleasant conversation, because there is nothing to gain from being kind in that moment, which means the kindness, or the lack of it, is closer to automatic. How someone responds to being told no reveals how they handle not being in control. Some people accept it and adjust. Some negotiate respectfully. Some escalate guilt, anger, or manipulation the moment they do not get their way. How someone behaves when they are wrong is one of the strongest predictors of how they will treat you when things eventually go wrong between you. And in any long relationship, personal or professional, things eventually go wrong. Clean acknowledgement, minimizing, or immediately blaming circumstances, each one tells a different story about what happens later. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The people who handle pressure with steadiness are not people who feel nothing. They are people who have separated the event from their reaction to it. And that separation is exactly what reveals character under strain. None of these moments need to be dramatic to be useful. Small pressures, a delayed flight, a disagreement over dinner, a minor mistake at work are often more revealing than major crises because people prepare mentally for major crises. Nobody prepares a performance for a delayed flight. That is exactly why the small, unplanned moments of friction are where the truth quietly leaks out. Two people can say the exact same sentence, "I am fine with the change of plans," and mean two completely different things. One says it while already reaching for their coat, adjusting easily to the new plan without another thought. The other says it with a tightness in the jaw, a slight pause before the word fine, a subject change that arrives just a little too quickly afterward. The words matched, the pressure response did not. Learning to notice that second case, the small friction hiding underneath an agreeable sentence, prevents years of assuming someone is fine with something that has actually been quietly building resentment the entire time. pressure does not only reveal negative traits, it reveals positive ones just as reliably, and this deserves equal attention. Someone who stays genuinely steady, kind, and fair during a stressful, chaotic situation, a canceled flight, a family emergency, a sudden change of plans, is showing something real about their capacity, not performing generosity for an audience, because chaos rarely leaves enough attention left over for a convincing performance. If comfortable conditions can hide a difficult character, they can just as easily undersell a genuinely steady one, someone whose best qualities only fully surface once something actually goes wrong. Chapter 6. The Power of the Calm Observer. There is a specific kind of person who moves through every room with quiet advantage, and it is rarely the loudest, most reactive person present. It is the calm observer, the person who does not need to react instantly, who watches before speaking, who lets others reveal themselves while remaining difficult to read in return. Reaction is a form of information leakage. Every impulsive reaction reveals what affects a person, where their boundaries are weak, what they need from others in that moment. People who are easily provoked are easy to steer because their emotional buttons are visible and predictable. The calm observer does not eliminate emotion. They delay the response. That small delay creates space, and space is where choice lives instead of pure reflex. Calm is often mistaken for weakness, but calm actually requires more strength than reaction does. It takes strength to pause when emotion is pushing toward an immediate response. It takes strength to listen fully when the ego wants to interrupt and defend itself. Passive people avoid action entirely. Calm people choose their moment deliberately, an entirely different skill. The ancient philosopher Lao Tzu wrote that silence is a source of great strength. There is a strange effect silence has on human behavior. When the usual noise of constant reaction disappears, other people instinctively feel pressure to fill the gap themselves, and in doing so, they often explain more than they intended to, justify things nobody asked them to justify, or reveal motives without being directly questioned. The calm observer does not seek power over others. They seek clarity within themselves, and that internal orientation changes everything about how they move through the world. Their stability does not depend on external validation, which makes them remarkably difficult to manipulate, and it earns a kind of quiet respect that loud confidence rarely manages to produce. Imagine a heated disagreement at a family dinner, voices rising, old grievances resurfacing, everyone reaching for the next point before the last one has even landed. In the middle of that noise, one person says nothing for a long moment, simply listening, and then responds slowly, addressing only the actual point just made rather than 3 other points from years ago. That single delayed response often does more to lower the temperature of the entire room than any argument could, because it refuses to feed the momentum everyone else is unconsciously building together. Calm, in that moment, is not passivity. It is the only force in the room powerful enough to interrupt a pattern everyone else is running on autopilot. Becoming a calm observer is not about suppressing every emotion until nothing is felt at all. Suppression and regulation look similar from the outside and are completely different on the inside. Suppression is a pressure cooker, emotion pushed down without release, eventually surfacing sideways as exhaustion, irritability, or a sudden disproportionate reaction to something small. Regulation is a wider container. Emotion fully felt and acknowledged internally, simply not acted on impulsively before it has been understood. The calm observer feels everything the reactive person feels, The difference is entirely in the half-second of space placed between the feeling and the response. This half-second can be built deliberately, and it grows easier with repetition, the same way any physical skill improves with practice. It starts small, noticing the very first flicker of a strong reaction, the tightening in the chest, the heat rising in the face, and simply naming it silently. This is anger. This is embarrassment. This is fear, before deciding what to do next. That tiny act of naming, done consistently, is often enough to convert a reflex into a genuine choice, which is the entire difference between reacting and observing. Chapter 7. The 5 Masks. People wear. People do not usually wear one single mask. They tend to rotate between a handful of familiar roles depending on the situation, and recognizing these patterns makes entire interactions far easier to interpret correctly. The first mask is the pleaser, agreeing quickly, avoiding conflict at almost any cost, endlessly accommodating. Underneath, the pleaser is often terrified of rejection, and their agreement tells far less about their true opinion than it does about their fear of disapproval. The second mask is the performer, charming, quick with humor, always seeming to be the center of the room. Underneath, the performer is often seeking validation they never fully receive, no matter how much attention they collect. The third mask is the controller, needing to organize, direct, and manage everything and everyone around them. Underneath, the controller is often deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty, and their need for control is less about power for its own sake and more about anxiety being managed through structure. The fourth mask is the martyr, frequently mentioning how much they sacrifice, how hard they work, how little appreciation they receive. Underneath, the martyr is often seeking acknowledgement they feel unable to ask for directly, expressing the need through complaint instead of a simple, honest request. The fifth mask is the analyst, staying detached, logical, and unemotional, even in situations that clearly warrant an emotional response. Underneath, the analyst is often protecting themselves from being hurt by staying one careful step removed from vulnerability. Recognizing these masks is not about placing people into rigid boxes forever. Most people shift between several of these patterns depending on stress, environment, and relationship. The value of recognizing the mask is simple. It allows a response to the fear underneath the behavior instead of a reaction only to the behavior on the surface, which changes almost every difficult interaction into something far easier to navigate with accuracy instead of frustration. The martyr mask deserves a closer look because it is often the most misunderstood of the 5. On the surface, the constant mention of sacrifice can sound like simple complaining, and it is easy to grow tired of hearing it. Underneath, there is usually a person who was never taught how to ask directly for what they need, perhaps because asking directly was discouraged or even punished earlier in life. Responding to the surface complaint with irritation only confirms their belief that direct needs are unwelcome. Responding to the need underneath by asking plainly what would actually help often produces a completely different conversation than the one the surface complaint seemed to be starting. It is worth noting that most people carry a primary mask and a secondary one switching, depending on how safe a given environment feels. Someone might wear the performer mask at work, where charm and visibility feel necessary for advancement, and quietly slip into the analyst mask at home, detached and logical, simply to recover from the energy the performance required all day. Neither mask is the full person. The full person is closer to whatever shows up in the handful of moments when neither mask feels necessary at all, usually alone, or with the one or two people who have earned enough safety to see underneath both. Chapter 8. Spotting the liar, the manipulator, and the fake friend. Most people imagine dishonesty as something dramatic, an obvious lie caught in the act. In reality, most deception is quiet, small, and easy to miss unless you know exactly what to look for. Liars tend to over-explain. Someone telling the truth about something simple usually states it plainly without needing to justify every detail. Someone constructing a lie often adds unnecessary explanation, extra detail nobody asked for, subconsciously trying to make the story feel more convincing than it needs to be. Liars often reverse their pronouns under pressure. A subtle shift from I to we, or from a direct we did this to a vaguer things happened, distancing themselves from responsibility for an action while still technically discussing it. Manipulators tend to use a specific pattern, warmth offered, and then abruptly withdrawn the moment compliance does not follow. This creates a cycle of working hard to earn back an approval that was withdrawn deliberately as a control mechanism. Affection consistently tied to compliance is not affection. It is leverage. Fake friends often show a specific pattern around success and struggle, enthusiastic and present during difficulty, because struggle does not threaten their own sense of status. Quiet, distant, or subtly critical during success, because success creates an uncomfortable comparison they are not prepared to sit with. Genuine friends show the opposite pattern, real enthusiasm for wins and steady presence during struggles, without needing either to serve their own ego. None of these signals alone proves dishonesty or bad intent with certainty. The value here is pattern recognition over time, not instant judgment in a single moment. When several of these signals repeat consistently around the same person, that is no longer coincidence. That is a pattern, and patterns, unlike single moments, are almost always telling the truth. Consider someone who consistently shows up with warmth right before asking for a favor, and grows noticeably harder to reach the moment the favor is no longer needed. On any single occasion, this could be explained away. A busy week, a coincidence, a bad connection on the phone. Repeated across many months, the explanation stops holding. The warmth was never random. It was scheduled, timed to precede a request, and absent everywhere else. Recognizing this pattern does not require confrontation. It simply requires adjusting expectations to match the evidence, offering warmth back in proportion to what is actually being received, rather than what is hoped for. A gentler distinction matters here too. The difference between someone who is manipulative and someone who is simply anxious and over-apologizes or over-explains out of nervous habit rather than calculation. The manipulator's pattern serves their own advantage consistently at a cost to someone else, and repeats regardless of whether it is pointed out. The anxious over-explainer's pattern often eases considerably once they feel safe and are met with patience rather than suspicion. Watching whether the behavior responds to safety or simply continues regardless of it is one of the clearest ways to separate genuine manipulation from ordinary human nervousness. It is worth adding one final safeguard here. None of these signals should ever be used to build a case against someone in order to win an argument or to feel superior in a disagreement. The purpose of noticing a pattern of dishonesty or manipulation is protection, deciding how much trust and access to extend going forward, not ammunition for a confrontation. The moment these tools get used to score points instead of to stay safe, they stop serving clarity and start serving ego, which is exactly the trap worth avoiding. Chapter 9. Reading the Heart. Love, dating, and hidden intentions. Romantic relationships are where reading people matters most, and yet it is exactly where most people abandon their observation skills entirely, replacing them with hope. Attraction has a way of dissolving critical thinking, which is precisely why this skill needs to be strongest here, not weakest. How someone treats you during disagreement matters more than how they treat you during the honeymoon phase, when everything feels easy. The real information comes from watching how a person handles being told no, being disappointed, or being asked to compromise. The gap between words and actions around commitment tells its own story. Someone who talks constantly about the future but consistently avoids concrete plans is often more comfortable with the idea of a relationship than with the reality of showing up for one. Words about tomorrow are cheap. Actions today are the actual currency of commitment. How someone discusses previous relationships reveals a preview of the future. Consistent blame placed entirely on former partners with no acknowledgement of their own role in what went wrong is often a preview of how they will eventually discuss you once enough time and friction have passed. How someone behaves around your other relationships, friends, family, coworkers also matters. Healthy partners generally support your other connections. Controlling partners often find subtle ways to create distance because isolation, even gentle and gradual isolation, makes control significantly easier to maintain over time. How someone treats you specifically when you have nothing to offer them in that moment, tired, unglamorous, having a difficult day, is often the clearest window into how you will actually be treated over the long run. Far clearer than an exciting first month full of effort and performance. Early caution, careful observation without paranoia, protects years of investment from being placed into a story the evidence was quietly contradicting from the very beginning. Consider two very different early dating patterns. In the first, someone moves quickly, declaring deep feelings within days, insisting on constant contact, growing upset at any normal need for space. It feels intense, and intensity often gets mistaken for depth. In reality, this pace frequently signals urgency rather than genuine connection, a need to lock something down before it can be evaluated calmly. In the second pattern, someone moves steadily, curious, attentive, but comfortable with normal pauses and independent plans on both sides. It can feel less dramatic in the early weeks, and it is very often the pattern that is actually built to last, precisely because it was never rushed past the point where real evaluation could happen. Jealousy is another signal worth reading carefully rather than accepting at face value. A small amount, acknowledged honestly and calmly, is simply part of caring about someone. A pattern of jealousy used to justify checking someone's phone, restricting who they see, or demanding constant proof of loyalty is a different signal entirely. One of control disguised as devotion. The distinguishing question is simple. Does the feeling get named and discussed like an emotion, or does it get used as justification for a rule imposed on the other person? One is intimacy. The other is a leash with a soft voice attached to it. Chapter 10. Reading the Room, Power, Status, and Hidden Agendas at Work. Professional environments run on unspoken rules that are rarely stated directly, yet they shape nearly every outcome that matters: promotions, trust, influence, and opportunity. Learning to read these dynamics protects effort from being invisible or misdirected. There is a difference between positional power, the title on the door, and real influence. The person whose opinion quietly shapes decisions before they are ever formally announced. Watching who people glance toward before answering a difficult question in a meeting often reveals where the real influence actually sits. Information travels unevenly in most organizations. Some people are informed early and consistently, others consistently last. And where anyone sits in that flow tells a great deal about their actual standing, regardless of what a job title suggests on paper. Credit and blame reveal culture. Environments where credit flows upward and blame flows downward, regardless of who actually did the work or made the mistake, are built on protecting hierarchy rather than protecting truth. And this single pattern predicts a tremendous amount about how safe it actually is to take creative risks there. Language around commitments matters too. Vague language, we will look into it, let's circle back, often signals a soft no delivered without the discomfort of a direct one. Specific language with dates, names, and clear next steps signals genuine intent to follow through. How someone behaves once they no longer need something cuts through almost every professional mask instantly. Warmth that exists only while someone is useful is not warmth. It is a temporary and highly conditional transaction, and recognizing that early protects both energy and trust from being spent in the wrong direction. Picture a project where credit for a successful outcome is announced publicly by the person who oversaw it, while the specific people who solved the hardest technical problems along the way go unmentioned in that same announcement. This single moment, repeated across enough projects, tells a very clear story about where an organization's real values sit, regardless of the mission statement printed on the wall in the lobby. Noticing this pattern early is not cynicism. It is simply accurate information about where effort is likely to be recognized in the future and where it is likely to quietly disappear into someone else's summary instead. Titles and job descriptions describe intended authority. Behavior in the room describes actual authority, and the two overlap far less often than most people assume when they first walk into a new workplace. Meetings themselves offer a smaller, faster version of this same reading. Notice who interrupts and who gets interrupted, and notice whether that pattern holds steady regardless of the quality of the point being made. Notice who apologizes before speaking, even when they are about to make the most useful point in the room. Notice who receives a follow-up question and who gets a polite nod and silence. None of these small moments prove anything on their own, but stacked across enough meetings, they map the real hierarchy of a room far more accurately than any organizational chart pinned to a wall ever could. None of this needs to breed cynicism about work itself. Most organizations are simply groups of imperfect people trying to coordinate under pressure, not elaborate conspiracies. The value of reading these patterns is practical, not paranoid. Knowing where real influence sits so that time and energy get invested where they will actually be seen and matter, rather than spent entirely on the version of the organization printed on paper, which rarely matches the one actually running the room from day to day. Chapter 11. The Mirror Effect, Reading Yourself Before Anyone Else. Every skill covered so far points outward toward other people. But the most advanced level of reading people actually points inward first, because emotional state constantly colors what is perceived in others, whether it is noticed or not. Projection is the most common distortion. Anxiety makes neutral behavior look like rejection. Insecurity makes confidence in others look like arrogance. An old wound makes simple honesty look like an attack. Recognizing your own emotional state before interpreting someone else's behavior is not optional if accuracy matters. It is a mandatory first step. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life." There is a simple, practical habit built on that idea. Before reacting to something upsetting, one honest question changes everything. Is this a response to what actually just happened, or a response to what this reminds me of from somewhere else? Asked consistently over time, this single question dramatically increases how accurately people around you get read, because it separates what is genuinely happening in front of you from what your own history is quietly projecting onto the moment. Self-awareness also protects against becoming exactly the kind of person this audiobook has been teaching you to recognize in others. The performer chasing approval, the controller managing anxiety through control, the martyr expressing unmet needs through complaint instead of a direct request. Everyone carries traces of these patterns. The goal is not perfection. The goal is awareness, catching a pattern mid-motion instead of only noticing it clearly in hindsight, after the damage to a relationship or opportunity has already been done. As reading people improves, awareness of your own reactions improves too, because the same sharpened attention that notices a flicker of discomfort in someone else's face eventually starts noticing that same flicker internally. That noticing may be the single most valuable outcome of everything covered in this audiobook. Imagine feeling a sudden flash of irritation at a friend who arrives 15 minutes late, far more irritation than 15 minutes would normally seem to justify. The immediate assumption is usually that the friend has done something disrespectful. Sitting with the reaction a little longer sometimes reveals something else entirely. A much older memory of being kept waiting by someone else, years earlier, who never fully explained why. The current friend becomes, without either person realizing it, a stand-in for an old, unresolved feeling. None of this excuses genuine disrespect when it is actually present. But separating an old wound from a present moment before responding is what allows the present moment to be judged on its own actual evidence, rather than on borrowed pain from somewhere else entirely. This same mirror effect explains why the people who are hardest to read accurately are often the people closest to us, not strangers. Distance makes projection easier to notice because there is less history clouding the view. Closeness makes projection almost invisible, because the history feels like part of the present moment rather than a separate layer sitting on top of it. The practical adjustment is simple, even if it is not always easy. With the people closest to any life, it helps to ask the mirror question more often, not less, precisely because the temptation to skip it, to assume instant understanding after years together, is strongest exactly there. Self-awareness, in the end, is not a separate skill from reading other people. It is the same skill, aimed inward instead of outward. Every mask described earlier in this audiobook, the pleaser, the performer, the controller, the martyr, the analyst, lives inside the observer too, in smaller or larger amounts, waiting to be noticed with the same patient curiosity offered to everyone else along the way. Chapter 12. Living as the Calm Observer. By now, this audiobook has moved through masks, voice, pressure, deception, love, and work. But understanding people is not simply a stack of individual techniques to apply mechanically. It is a different way of moving through the world entirely, one built on clarity instead of assumption. Living as the calm observer does not mean withdrawing from people, becoming cold, or trusting no one. It means engaging fully while remaining grounded in what the evidence actually shows, rather than what is hoped for or feared. Real trust gets extended, but based on repeated behavior, not on charm or good intentions alone. This shift changes relationships in a quiet but profound way. Behavior that was never actually personal stops being personalized. Clarity stops being chased from people who are simply not capable of giving it. Heavy investment stops flowing where the pattern has already answered the question honestly, long before anyone was ready to accept it. This is not withdrawal from life. This is alignment with reality. And alignment, more than optimism or effort alone, is what actually protects energy, time, and peace of mind over the long run. Understanding people also teaches a quiet form of humility. Most people are not malicious. Most people are simply conditioned, repeating patterns that once helped them survive something difficult, long before this moment. Seeing this does not mean excusing harmful behavior. It means understanding its origin clearly enough that disappointment does not curdle into permanent bitterness. The Roman philosopher Seneca once wrote that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Much of the pain in misreading people comes not from what they actually do, but from the story imagined about what it means. The calm observer trades that imagined story for the evidence actually in front of them. And that trade, more than any single technique in this audiobook, is where real peace begins. Living this way daily does not look dramatic from the outside. It looks like pausing half a second longer before responding to a sharp comment. It looks like waiting for a second or third data point before deciding what someone actually meant. It looks like extending patience to a mask while quietly watching for what it is protecting. None of this requires announcing to anyone that a new way of seeing has been learned. The calm observer rarely needs to explain the shift out loud. The shift simply shows up quietly in how much less often they are surprised and how much more steadily they move through days that used to feel confusing. There is a final piece worth naming honestly. Becoming this kind of observer does not make life painless. People will still disappoint. Patterns will still sometimes take longer to see than anyone would like, and even the calmest observer occasionally gets read wrong themselves. The goal was never a life free of all misunderstanding. The goal was a meaningful reduction in how often confusion turns into lasting damage, and a much faster recovery whenever it does happen, because the tools for seeing clearly are already in hand rather than still waiting to be learned the hard way, in the middle of the very situation that needed them most. Conclusion: the gift of seeing clearly. Understanding people does not give power over them. It gives freedom from confusion, and that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire audiobook. Throughout this listening experience, one truth kept repeating, in different forms. People rarely reveal themselves through what they say. They reveal themselves through patterns, reactions, silences, timing, and consistency under pressure. Masks slip under exhaustion and low-stakes moments. Pressure exposes character faster than comfort ever could. The voice often confesses what the mouth is carefully trying to hide. And the calm observer, quiet, steady, and unshaken, almost always sees more clearly than the person who reacts to every single thing immediately. This knowledge is not meant to harden anyone. It is meant to steady them. When people are understood clearly, what was never personal stops being internalized. Clarity stops being chased from people who were never equipped to offer it. And in that space, something shifts. Life does not become easier, but the fighting against reality stops. The expecting depth from people living on the surface stops. And the waiting on accountability from people who consistently avoid it stops. This clarity also builds humility. Most people are not malicious. They are conditioned, repeating patterns that once protected them, whether or not the reason is ever fully understood. Seeing this does not mean excusing harm. It means understanding its limits. And understanding those limits keeps ordinary disappointment from hardening into lasting bitterness. Perhaps most importantly, this understanding turns inward as well as outward. As the skill of reading others grows, so does the awareness of the self, catching a reaction before it runs away, noticing a projection before it distorts what is actually happening in front of you. That inward awareness is where real emotional intelligence becomes lived experience, not just information once listened to. In a world full of noise, performance, and misunderstanding, the ability to see quietly and precisely is rare. It offers steadiness where others feel chaos, patience where others rush, and a kind of confidence that does not need constant outside approval to hold its shape. Control is not the goal. Changing people is not the goal. Being understood by everyone is not the goal. Seeing clearly is the goal, because clarity protects energy, clarity preserves peace, and clarity is where real, quiet power has always lived. Think back to where this audiobook began. That strange feeling in the stomach after a conversation that looked fine on the surface. That feeling was never a flaw. It was an early, unrefined version of exactly the skill this entire audiobook has been sharpening. A sense that something beneath the words did not match. What was missing was not the instinct. What was missing was the vocabulary and the patience to trust that instinct instead of arguing it away. That same instinct, once trusted instead of argued away, becomes the quiet foundation everything else in this audiobook was built on top of, chapter by chapter, example by example, until it stopped feeling like a technique and started feeling like simply how the world is seen now. Every chapter here has been an attempt to hand back that trust, piece by piece, so that the next time a conversation leaves a strange feeling behind, it can be met with curiosity instead of self-doubt, and with a calm, specific question, what did I actually just see? Instead of a long night spent wondering what might be wrong. That question, repeated across enough ordinary days, across enough ordinary people, is where all of this quietly becomes permanent, not as a technique reached for occasionally, but as the new, steady way of simply paying attention to the world. One last thought before this ends. The people encountered in life are not puzzles to be solved and set aside. They are ongoing stories, still being written, still capable of surprising in both directions, for better and for worse. What this audiobook offers is not a final verdict machine. It is a better set of eyes. Eyes that notice more, assume less, and stay calm in the space between the two. Carry that quietly. Use it kindly. And let it make the people in this life a little less confusing and a little more human every single day from here on. Thank you for spending this time listening closely to these ideas and to the people they were written to help you understand a little better. If something in here already changed how you plan to walk into your next conversation, that is the entire purpose this audiobook was built for. This has been Coffee and Chapters. Until the next chapter, keep your coffee close, keep your eyes open, and keep seeing clearly.